Let's get it going here. Dosha, everybody. Hello, my name is Michael Johnson. I'm a citizen of the three affiliated tribes of North Dakota, and I'm the Director of Advancement with the NDN Collective. Our mission at NDN is to build, steward, and grow Indigenous power that amplifies and uplifts self-determination while fostering a world that is more equitable and just for all people in the planet. We do this through a holistic perspective to problem solving that takes an integrated capital and direct action approach to building Indigenous power. You can hear more about how we're actively dismantling and challenging white supremacy with our keynote, with the keynote tomorrow afternoon with Nick Tilson, our founding president and CEO. To center the conversation today, I just wanted to offer a couple words of encouragement and thank everybody for joining us. We recognize the power of coming together as a community. We recognize the power that we have in unity. And we recognize that we have all the answers to solve the problems within ourselves. Like never before, Indigenous people and our issues have been elevated into national conversations, and we're just honored that you guys are here with us today, so thank you. A little bit of housekeeping, just keep it clean while we're going here. The conversation may move quickly, so if there are any questions, please use the Q&A, and we'll try to answer them live. We will leave a little bit of time at the end of the session to get to any questions that we weren't able to answer. And just to offer a little bit of context here about Native Americans, Indigenous populations here in the US. Demographically, there's 5.2 million Native Americans in the 2010 census. We're going to see that number go up this year with some of the great action and positive programs to get the count up. There's over 700 tribes in this country, right? We have 573 federally recognized tribes, 200 state recognized tribes. Tribal nations in aggregate are the 13th largest employer in the nation. And we manage approximately 56 million acres of land held in trust for us by the United States government. Over the last year, there were 2 Native American presidential forums where we brought together tribal leaders, citizens, political candidates to talk about issues of importance in Indian communities, such as missing and murdered Indigenous women, climate change, media representation, and the list goes on. Native American voters in 2020, in the 2020 electoral cycle have the opportunity to influence major swing states like Colorado, Michigan, Minnesota, Nevada, North Carolina, and Wisconsin. With that, it is my honor to introduce our esteemed panelists. Ms. Judith LeBlanc, a citizen of the Caddo Nation, President or CEO of the Native Organizers Alliance, and Chair of the Board of NDN Collective, and our friend Julian Brave Noisecat, a citizen of the Kanem-Tasikan, and a director of the Green New Deal strategy with the Data for Progress, and a senior media fellow with the NDN Collective. So thank you guys for joining us today for this conversation. Julian, I want to start with you. Can you give us a little information, maybe an intro, and then a little information about the challenges you're seeing in organizing the Native vote right now?
Well, firstly, thank you so much for having me, Michael, and it's good to see Judith on the Zoom. I usually run into Judith across Indian country. I've run into her in Rapid City and Sioux City, Iowa, and I don't know, all over the place. So it's really good to be here. My name is Julian Noisecat. I am calling you guys today from my breakfast nook in Washington, D.C. in Piscataway territory. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. I come at this work from a couple of different angles. The first is as a journalist, so I do a lot of reporting across Indian country, and then I also work for, help run a think tank actually called Data for Progress, a progressive think tank that specializes particularly in policy work and public opinion research. So we run a lot of surveys. So, you know, from what I'm seeing in terms of organizing the Native vote is sort of overall, there's a growing sort of power in Indian country as a political force in this country. But that is primarily not recognized either by sort of the political gatekeepers in, generally speaking, sort of the Democratic Party orbit, And it's also often not recognized by the national media. And for those reasons, although there is a lot of very powerful organizing happening, including around elections in Indian country, the party and then also the press are not often seeing and acknowledging the importance of Native communities and Native voters in places like Arizona, where the Native vote may very well play a crucial role in deciding not only who our next president is, but also which party controls the Senate. And so just sort of a quick overview of what I'm seeing in Indian country right now. Of course, since Standing Rock, we've seen that Native people are able to lead national moments of organizing, moments for Indigenous sovereignty and justice that are very powerful. And of course, organizing is, as I'm sure folks at Netroots know, one of the crucial ingredients to power and success in politics. And of course, both of our fresh women Native representatives in Congress, both Representative Holland and Representative Davids, actually went to Standing Rock. So that's an important part of their story, as it is an important part of the story for someone like Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was recruited to run for Congress when she was doing some volunteer organizing in solidarity with Standing Rock. So that's one part of sort of the trend that we're seeing. I think beyond that, we are also seeing, truthfully, let's not beat around the bush here. Money is an important part, an ingredient to political power. And while there's a great deal of economic diversity across Indian country, reservations span from, some of the poorest zip codes and areas in the nation to places that have now been able to, through gaming and other business ventures, been able to create a real economic base for their people. And some tribes, particularly regionally, are real political players and are able to donate to campaigns and have the ear of members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. And so tribes are really, because in part of sort of the growing revenue base that some of them have been able to build, are a real sort of force in regional politics and increasingly in national politics as well. So we have organizing power, and we have increasingly the power of the purse, the power of the dollar. The things that I think that we're building increasingly, which is incredibly exciting, are leadership as well. We of course have the first two Native American women in Congress. The Democratic Party has created a Native caucus, and we're on the way to having a Native caucus in Congress, which would be a huge step in the right direction. And of course, having sort of representatives and leaders in elected office, folks not just like Representative Holland and Davids, but also folks like Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan in Minnesota, and a number of other, particularly Native women, up and down the ballot, up and down the bench, is really sort of making strides in the right direction. So we have growing leaders. But the thing that I think we're really missing so far, and I think that this is one of the greatest areas for growth in Indian country, is the media representation, the communications, the fact that actually if you turn on any of the major cable news networks on any given night, you're not going to see a Native voice, speaking to our issues. And you're not often going to see much coverage of, what matters to Native voters. You're not going to know, for example, that the vote in Navajo County in Arizona is going to play a crucial role in determining, which presidential candidate carries that state and which party wins that Senate seat. And so I think that while there's been a lot of positive strides in Indian country, particularly over recent years, in terms of our leadership, in terms of our ability to fundraise, in terms of our ability to organize, we are not often seeing that reflected in the coverage and the representation in sort of mass communications that continue to invisibilize Native voters. So while there's lots of great work going on, most people don't know about it, and that we see that show up in the ways that we're not seen in the press, and we're not seen often by sort of the leaders in the party that we tend to vote for, which is the Democratic Party.
That's great information, Julian. Thank you so much. Follow-up question, just real quick, talking about what you're seeing, how the Navajo vote might go down in Arizona, or what you're thinking generally about the Native vote in the state.
Yeah, I mean, so that's something that I'm actually interested in reporting on a little bit more. I recently talked to a woman named Janie Parrish, who's going down to Navajo County to help lead the Democratic Party of Arizona's efforts down there to organize and get out the vote. Um, I think that one of the big challenges that we're going to face is that, firstly, in a place like Navajo County, most people vote in person. So they'll go to probably the chapter house on the Navajo Nation, and they'll usually vote in person. But of course, we have the coronavirus now. And so one of the big challenges is going to be to get mail-in ballots out to people who maybe don't have an address, a traditional address. Maybe they use a PO box, for example. That's going to be a real challenge. And then also, how do you contact voters, particularly older voters, at their homes when you don't have an address? And then lastly, when many of them, their first language, their primary language they maybe use in the household, particularly if they're elders, is the Navajo language. And so I think all of those challenges, going into what has been one of the hot spots of the coronavirus and trying to reach this population that reliably votes pretty Democratic, is going to be like it's going to be across the country a significant challenge. And thankfully, we have very driven folks like Janie and others who are going to be down there trying to do that work effectively on the ground. And encouragingly, the Navajo Nation has actually, in terms of its governing sort of response to the coronavirus, done arguably better than the state of Arizona in terms of implementing, social distancing measures, lockdowns, stay at home, curfews over the weekend, all that sort of stuff. So I actually feel fairly confident that they will. I mean, it's going to be a challenge, but they're going to do the right thing when it comes to the election in November.
Thank you, Julian. Judith, turning to you, if you could please give us a little bit more of an intro for yourself, and then also talk from your perspective in grassroots organizing, what you're seeing as some of the challenges right now.
So my name is Judith LeBlanc. I'm a citizen of the Caddo Nation of Oklahoma, and I am the director of the Native Organizers Alliance. It's a national Native and training network that was born out of the grassroots organizing in Indian country for Obamacare and the passage of the Indian Health Improvement Act, which was rolled into Obamacare. I live in Lenape territory, otherwise known as Harlem, New York. And I'm an urban Indian that gets to spend pre-Rona majority of my time in Indian communities across the country. And there are many now Indian groups and tribal entities who have decided that this is the most important election we've ever faced and are rolling up their sleeves and getting involved in civic and voter engagement for the first time ever. So I share Julian's concern about Arizona, but on the plus side is that the Navajo Reservation has a much higher, historically, much higher percentage of people turning out to vote, averaging around 60% in national elections. And the irony that the Rona has cast on almost every element of life, political, economic, cultural, the irony is that the Navajo tribal government had gotten an agreement with the state attorney general to open up new voting sites in 3 of the key counties on the Navajo Reservation, which would enable 18,000 Native voters to vote for the first time near their hogans, near to home. The power of the Navajo vote in the state of Arizona is amazing. In fact, the senatorial candidates started campaigning on the Navajo Res last year in both parties because they know the power of the Navajo vote between the Res as well as in the urban areas of the state. But the challenge that's faced not only on Navajo, but all over Indian country is the Rona and the impact that it will have and has had, which, we have some of the highest infection rates right now are on Indian reservations in some of the key swing states, including Arizona. And turning towards a mail-in vote, which is good for the health of our peoples, of all the people, there is a big downside for rural communities and Native communities in particular, because post offices are not around the corner and neither are mailboxes. So to drive to a post office, pick up the mail, take it home, fill out the ballot, drive back, get a stamp and mail it, a lot of slips between the cup and the lip can happen. And it means gas money, because you're not talking about driving a mile in many of these situations. So the mail-in ballot, it presents a dilemma. So for example, in Nevada, which is now one of the swing states, one of the battleground states where the Indian vote is one of the swing votes, they are going to be doing all mail-in. So one of the tribes is discussing, because each state is different, one of the tribes is discussing whether or not they could deputize, in agreement with the state, deputize their community health representatives, they're called CHRs, who go to Indian homes all over the res, take blood pressure test blood, do that kind of caring for our sick and elderly. They're the most trusted people on the res, really. And so one tribe is thinking about deputizing those workers to collect ballots. Now, in some states, that's illegal. In California, which is a big Native vote, that harvesting votes, as they say, is totally legal. So there's a challenge. But I got to say one thing. The challenge of COVID is really going to be, I think, overcome by the fact that we've interrupted the narrative a number of times. Standing Rock, when we were there, created a city of Indians to stop a pipeline. We interrupted the narrative, but we continue to. In 2018, the election of 2 Indian women to Congress for the first time, you have to recognize that we've never had our Barbara Lee. We've never had our Maxine Waters for our children to see women governing for the whole. And that has really lifted up the consciousness of how electoral power is connected to political power at the grassroots, political power that the movements build. So in 2018, it was the largest number of Indian candidates ever. This year, oh my God, we have 8 candidates for Congress. You just take the state of Minnesota. I think there are like 10 candidates all over the state who are running for elected office, many for the first time. And I think that what we experienced at Standing Rock in 2018, in the midterm elections, the state of North Dakota won a court decision, then tried to, therefore, that would effectively strip us of the right to vote by requiring addresses on licenses. Well, we went there the month before, Native Organizers Alliance, and worked with the tribe. And I think we have the formula for what we need to do in 2020. And that is, we organized on a traditional basis. We went to the grandmas. We brought the grandmas together. The grandmas reached out to the communities, and we were able to work with over 100 volunteers who went door to door every day for a month, resulting in over 90% voter engagement and a 300% increase in absentee early voting, despite the obstacles that the state had put in place. We were like the canaries in the coal mine. That's what happened to us 2018 in North Dakota. But now every vote is faced with that. So the Indian vote in Wisconsin, Nevada, Minnesota, Arizona, Colorado, North Carolina, I said 7 states. We are really charged with protecting democracy, not just for ourselves, but for everybody, that we have to work together with our non-Native voter engagement folks.
Thanks, Judith. And to build off of that question, if you could just talk a little bit about the importance of building those coalitions and strong alliances right now as we're base building in Indian country.
Was that a follow-up for me or for Judith?
It was a follow-up for Judith, and we'll come over to you next there, Julian.
Well, one of the other big challenges we face in mobilizing the Native vote is resources, funding. A lot of money is put into swing states, but in these, or battleground states, and in these battleground states, we have the margin of, the margin of victory. And the truth is, for instance, Senator in Montana, who at the end of election night in 2018, he was losing, and when the res vote came in Montana, he had won, and he has said often how the Indian vote brought him into office. That's the role we can play, but we get very little funding until the last minute. Now, I think that there's been some shifts because we've interrupted the narrative because of the power of electing 2 Indian women to Congress and the local Indian elections. But the truth is that we don't get the kind of funding that we need in order to mobilize the vote. And we learned at Standing Rock that it's not just enough to bring people together to carry out the sacred task of protecting our vote, but you also have to contribute to their living and well-being. I mean, we're working in areas where there's generational unemployment. So I think resources, and those resources usually flow to these larger non-native voter engagement projects, which should put a line item in their budget to support the work in Indian, urban and reservation Indian vote engagement. The second thing is that we need to team up with non-native voting organizations to put the questions of concern of Indian communities alongside the questions that are being asked in the candidates' questionnaires. Where our voice, our concerns need to be right in the middle and in a part of what the voters are asking of all the candidates. So I think those alliances are critical in the 2020 election and our common and collective need to protect democracy.
We often talk at NDN about how we are not interested or looking for active allies, but looking for committed accomplices in the work that we're doing. And I think that holds true in this space also. Julian, we'd love to hear your reflections on what that coalition base building looks like right now.
Yeah, it's such a big and important question. And I would obviously agree with everything that Auntie Judith said on that subject. She's the organizer. I organize media people into doing tweets. Let's see. I mean, so the thing that I reflect on a lot is that politics at the end of the day is often about understanding what voters care about and figuring out, how to prioritize and talk about those issues in a way that reaches them, and on net, can create a majority from the electorate as it exists. That's basically what campaigns are supposed to do. That's what effective politicians do. And I think that a huge blind spot in sort of the operation of politics in particularly a world that's dominated now by data, where you can, if you're a campaign, if you're a politician, you can look at the data related to particular issue areas, what particular voters care about, and have a decent sense for, if I go out and I campaign on this issue or I say this thing, I can maybe gain this much, this many voters from this sort of subset of the electorate, and maybe I'll lose a few here, but on net, that's going to be okay. We just don't really have, and I think part of the reason why Native people are just starting to be incorporated into sort of the major coalition politics of the Democratic Party is that there's just not great data on what Native voters care about. I think that we have anecdotal data and the data from the real world, things like Standing Rock, which obviously, it should be said that Standing Rock, as Judith was saying, became one of the largest cities in North Dakota. It was a galvanizing moment for Native people across Indian country. Obviously, there was something going on where Standing Rock tapped into a very dominant and significant perspective in Indian country. But like, what about other issues that you know, we've seen often discussed with respect to Native people and politics? You know, what really are the views of Native people with respect to the controversy regarding Senator Elizabeth Warren's DNA? I don't actually think we know the answer to some of those very basic questions. I think it's also incredibly difficult for most polling firms to survey, you know, Native voters in places like Alaska, for example, where the Native vote is crucial to winning that state. I think it's really hard for pollsters to know the views of Native voters in Montana and what actually gets them to show up and vote for the Democratic Party. Same thing for Arizona. So, you know, I think that there are all these sort of cascading impacts from the fact that, firstly, a lot of people don't ask the question because they don't understand Native voters to be an essential portion of sort of the coalition that can get them to a majority. And secondly, you know, I think it's really difficult often to survey some populations. You know, there are difficulties that pollsters who survey Latino opinion or Latinx opinion face in reaching sort of that community. And I think that those problems are really magnified when it comes to Native people and elections and public opinion and the issues that matter to us. And one place where this really showed up recently was, of course, in sort of the polls around the Washington football team's name. You know, there was a polling firm that released a poll to the Washington Post where they took the views of some self-identified Native people and used them to argue that Native people were not mostly offended by the Washington football team's name. Meanwhile, a more sort of substantial poll, one that actually passed peer review and was published in an academic journal, actually found that you know, Native people, particularly people who have strong affinity for their Native identity, as according to survey research, actually do find the Washington football team's name, which is now changed, thankfully, to be offensive and to be a racial slur. And there was actually a correlation between having a stronger sense of your nation, a stronger affinity to your Native identity, and the likelihood that you are going to find the Washington football team's name to be offensive. And so I think that little microcosm, one in which, you know, there was sort of this polling that suggested one thing and then a peer-reviewed study that suggested another, really illustrates, I think, the challenge that we face here, which is that, you know, if campaigns are going to go out and try to attract Native voters, are going to try to include Native voters as part of their coalition to win, they're often starting from a significant handicap in understanding the views of Native people, where we actually stand on the issues that we care about, and how you can effectively speak to that community and get them to show up and vote for the Democratic Party.
Well, you know, Julian is making such an important point. And for those of you who are in the audience, if you are working with a local campaign, you need to think about the fact that the Democratic Party has not won the white vote since the 60s, period, full stop. It's never won the majority of the white vote. So Indians are a critical feature in some key states. We said the 7 states, but also in places like New Mexico. I think New Mexico, it's like we're 12% of the vote. Oklahoma, you know, Alaska, Julian brought up. But the fact is that in this moment, the Indian vote is very activated. This country has gone through a reckoning with its systemic racist history. I mean, the fact that Confederate statues and Columbus statues, even, you know, priests who participated in the missionaries in California, their statues are being torn down, shows that, number one, that systemic racism affects all communities of color and white people, because you had many of the people who were marching in streets, not just in Portland, were white. It is the most multiracial demonstrations against racism that has ever happened in this country, ever. And so we're in a situation where Indians can play a certain role in states which are decisive to defending democracy. And I think Julian's point that we've had very little polling, very few statistics are kept. And it's often said we're statistically insignificant. Well, we decided, working with Dr. Stephanie Freiberg, who was the designer of that survey that Julian referenced on racist stereotypes and the NFL team name. We're working with her and Illuma Native, another national Native group, and the Center for Native American Youth. And we have been conducting a survey, which is about to close on Saturday. But if you are Native and you are in our audience, take it and pass it on to your relatives. Nearly 6,000 people across Indian country have taken the survey. And it is the first time that a Native designed survey of Native people about the impact of COVID, governance, tribal, state, and federal, experiences with the democratic process and elections, identity, and issues. What are the key issues that need to be addressed immediately in order to improve our lives? It's going to be the first time that we have those findings. And the truth is, the preliminary review that we made a couple of days ago, a majority of people who are in federally recognized tribes, are like 66%, have participated in candidate or political rallies. Over 60% have donated to candidates. Over 80% have participated in demonstrations post the murder of George Floyd. Over 80% participated in public demonstrations before the murder of George Floyd. So it's a very activated electorate. And so for those of you who are organizing in those states where there are reservations and concentrations of Indians in the urban areas, best you do outreach, best you bring us into your circle and sit with us and bring us to the table that you're at, because we can make a huge difference in the outcome of the elections.
Thank you both for that. I think you both really point to just the hyper plurality of the those vying for political power and interest right now. And there really is no single way to get to these for any single group without making a coalition type move and finding where we can have those synergies and working together. So thank you for that. One last question, and then we'll get into the Q&A from the attendees. But I wanted to get some of your guys' reflections, just thinking about voting in national, federal, local, state elections in the United States and how this is juxtaposed against our ideas of empowering tribal sovereignty.
Well, I'll tell you, if we're ever going to achieve tribal sovereignty, it's going to be because we have a deeply democratic political system and a deeply democratic economic system. And tribal sovereignty will never be won tribe by tribe. It's a system change. It's a whole shift of power away from the domination of corporations, the rich and powerful, towards the grassroots and the people, and meeting the needs of all the peoples. Because the truth is that tribal sovereignty is good not only for Indians, and if we could do it alone, we would have a long time ago. But the truth is, it's good for everyone, because it would reflect a total shift in the economy and in the political system. But also, we find where we do better when we are developing economic regenerative models and creating a way for people to live a better life, that it does spill over to the border towns. It invigorates the regional economy. So there is a self-interest there, but there is more so a moral and inherent and a legal right that needs to be addressed. And we can do it in the framework of elections because we need people elected who understand that we have an inherent moral and legal right to protect water. We have an inherent moral and legal right to protect the land from being raped by coal and uranium and oil companies. And those rights have protected the land and water for many people. Pipeline has been stopped for over a decade because the tribes continue to fight in the courts to stop that pipeline. So wherever we're same thing in the Arctic, it's native-led initiatives to protect the land and water that are benefiting the broad majority of people who drink water, which is everyone. So tribal sovereignty and democracy, electing people who understand the nature of why sovereignty is important is the way we're going to democratize the economic system as well as the political system.
Julian?
I would agree with a lot of what Auntie Judith said there. I would just add a couple things. So firstly, I think that tribal sovereignty is a rather unusual issue in American politics. Firstly, it's not particularly polarized, and it's not significantly present usually in national debates about politics. Before I sort of pick that thread back up, I'll just say that when I was an undergrad, I studied with a professor named Audra Simpson, who's from the Ganawage Mohawk. And she has this whole thing, and her people, a lot of the Mohawk people have this whole thing where they actually don't even vote in federal elections, either in the United States or Canada, because they insist that they are still a sovereign people and that they have their own sovereign governments that they are committed to. And I have a lot of sympathy for that view, but obviously in my own professional life, that is, I wouldn't be talking to you about, Native Americans and Democratic Party politics and elections and stuff if I didn't participate in them. Why would I? So to pick up the thread again, tribal sovereignty shows up in very unusual and strange ways in American politics. This summer, we had one of the probably most significant Supreme Court decisions for treaty rights, certainly in the 21st century, and one of the most significant decisions ever. And that decision, the majority opinion, was actually delivered by Neil Gorsuch, a Trump appointee, a justice who is committed to a sort of originalist, textualist reading of the law, the same sort of reading of the law that leads to things that I very much do not agree with, such as, preventing women's right to choose, sort of stymieing gay marriage, and a number of other issues. That same sort of reading of the law was applied in this case to treaty rights and statutes, and actually worked very favorably for tribes. It turns out that if you read treaties with the original intention and with attention to what the treaties actually say, that's an incredibly favorable perspective to apply to treaty rights. And so we had this incredibly unusual thing, which I think people didn't really absorb because, treaty rights and tribal sovereignty and all that sort of stuff is kind of like, quantum physics to like sort of the Americans set their mind. But we had this incredible decision amidst the sort of uprising led by Black Lives Matter in favor of treaty rights, where it was a Trump appointee who wrote the majority opinion that will now be cited by tribal attorneys and Indian law attorneys for decades to come. And, who could have predicted that? I certainly could not have predicted that. If you could have predicted that, maybe you should have bet on it and predicted or something and made a good amount of money. So, this is all to say that there are really unusual ways in which tribal sovereignty sort of intersects with our partisan system. It doesn't neatly fall into sort of either the sort of left or the right of American politics. We have gotten unfavorable rulings in the Supreme Court from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is usually, considered a liberal stalwart. There's generally over the decades a dance that many tribes have done where when they're looking for funding for essential programs, they go to the Democrats, and when they're looking for a little bit more freedom from the colonial government, they go to Republicans. There's a degree of complexity and I would say sort of tactical flexibility that tribes have shown over the years and decades where, you know, regardless of which sort of power is in government, they've been able to advance, or we've been able to advance our rights and our interests and our sovereignty. And I think there's a lot there, and I wish that there were more political scientists, other people studying and writing about that, because it is truly fascinating. And I'm not certain that I have a fully fleshed out understanding of how it could be that, you know, Gorsuch, of all people, a Trump appointee of all people, could be the author of the majority opinion of one of the most significant treaty rights opinions ever written.
And if I may, Julian, just a little bit of historical context there with Justice Gorsuch. He spent 10 years in the 10th Circuit here in Denver as a federal judge, and had access to a lot of water cases and a lot of land cases that were coming up in his district. So there, I won't name names, but there was a handful of professional natives who knew that he was very intimate and understood Indian law through his originalist ideas around the Constitution. And yeah, those seem to be paying dividends right now. So
Well,
thank you. Go ahead.
Something. So tribal sovereignty is not a partisan issue. There's a legal element, there's an inherent element, and there's a moral imperative element to reckon with the history of this country. And it also argues, therefore, that when you look at the Supreme Court, we have to be engaged in presidential elections, because we have to have an inside-outside strategy. We need to be pressing, and I think we have the potential to do it now, in the platforms of these political parties, a stance and attitude towards tribal sovereignty. Deb Haaland is on the drafting committee of the DNC platform, and there are some very good things in there about the protection of land. But the truth is, as Julian cited, you know, RBG, you know, the great liberal, you know, Shiro, who I follow, she really has had not the best rulings. Same with Sotomayor. But the inside-outside strategy of being involved in the streets, I think that one of the biggest factors in people's thinking about treaties of late was the decision of the Supreme Court, and the right wing has been using scare tactics, and the NDN collective led action in the Black Hills that dramatized the significance and the importance of the treaty rights to the Black Hills. That got national media coverage. It interrupted the narrative. So I think we're in a moment where tribal sovereignty will become an issue that needs to be discussed for the good of everybody. It's not just an Indian issue, nor a partisan issue.
I could spend hours talking here with you two about this. Thank you so much for your reflections. Before we get cut off and the virtual panel has to move on, one question from our audience I'd love to get your guys' quick reflection on. For people that are in the political space and working as in strategy in those spaces, how can they be better accomplices, and what can they do to stand in solidarity with us? Judith.
Well, number one, I think, you know, if you live in Cleveland or Chicago or, you know, just about anywhere, 80% of us live in urban areas. They're like me, walk with a high heel on one foot and a moccasin on the other, or maybe a cowboy boot on one foot and a moccasin on the other. And so to reach out and make connections with the urban Indian centers that are all over the country, LA, San Francisco, Chicago, Cleveland, Boston, you know, all over the place. That's number one, to begin to build relationships. Number two, the issues. I mean, I think that we have to look at, in California, the forest fires there. Now they're finally turning to traditional ways to control the fires. They're going to native tribes, and I think there is a recognition that on an array of issues, you should build relationships now, from food sovereignty to the protection of water to other environmental justice issues, quality of life, but I think it starts with relationships. There's no magic answer to that. It's about the circle. It's about it, realizing we're all related, and we are. Even if you don't know Indians, and there are a lot of Indians in your state, what we do has an impact on you, and what you do has an impact on us. So understanding that relationality and building those relationships, that's the first step.
I'm not sure I have much to add beyond that. I guess I would just say that there's probably a lot more Native people out there wherever you happen to be doing your work or organizing than you might realize. I, for example, before the pandemic, whenever I had to go up to Capitol Hill, I reliably almost every single time would run into some sort of delegation or group of Native people who were there to talk to their congressional delegation or their representative, or to testify to the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, or any number of those things. And I think that little anecdote, the fact that whenever I go up to Capitol Hill, I end up running into Native people, is kind of illustrative of the fact that there are in fact Native people all across this country. 70% of Native people actually live in cities. So if you're in a city, there's more than likely, as Judith said, an urban Native community, an urban Indian center. And there are lots of different ways that you can get plugged in and sort of be in relationship with those communities. As Native people, I'll just say that we are quite welcoming people. We like to feed people. We like to we adopt people fairly often. we we date a lot of people. I don't know. I mean, just like come see our folks. And I think that that first step of just reaching out and maybe even if it feels uncomfortable, trying to develop those sorts of ties is essential. I mean, that's on the most basic level, that's the building blocks of organizing, of politics, of coalition, of all that sort of stuff.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. I got one more for you, and this one I think is going to be ripe for some discussion. Talk a little bit about what you're seeing with the census rollout this year and how it's going to lead into splitting or combining Indigenous political power in the future. Julia, let's start with you there.
The question was one more time? Sorry, Jade sent me a text message about what I just said.
What are you seeing right now with regard to the census rollout and how this is going to impact either our coming together or the further dissolution of Indigenous political power?
Yeah, the census is bad news. I'm working on a story about this right now. So for folks who don't know, they moved up the deadline of the what's it called? The folks who are actually going out and enumerators. They moved up the deadline for enumerators being in the field by an entire month. So just to give you the run of the entire story, the census was deeply underfunded. This was going to be the first year that they tested an online census. They actually had so little funding initially that they couldn't even test it on Standing Rock and the Colville Reservation, which is where they were planning on testing it. Then a pandemic hit. And so now you have reservations and communities across the country that are scrambling to try to make sure all their tribal citizens and residents of their reservation are counted. That is, of course, how funding for a number of essential federal programs are allocated. It's also how we allocate seats in the House of Representatives. So essentially, this is how power and money are allocated publicly. And, folks might be aware, but tribes are often very dependent on funding from the federal government for everything from roads to schools to healthcare. And essentially right now what we're seeing is I'm following a woman who is leading the complete count on the Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota. And they have 30% of people responding, more or less. And this is actually second most of any reservation in North Dakota. They're only behind Standing Rock. And so the potential for a massive undercount and the consequences that cascade from that because of massive government negligence are enormous. And it's not because there aren't really dedicated people across Indian country who are trying the best to count all their people. It's essentially because they've been put in an impossible circumstance to do an impossible task.
Thanks, Julian. Judith.
Well, we joined with the National Congress of American Indians and the Urban Indian Families Coalition and a number of other Indian groups and sending letters to Congress. And, you know, we need to call on all of you to take some action because it's a reflection of a totalitarian approach to governance. And we saw that in the response to the demonstrations after the murder of George Floyd. We're seeing this in the chronic, not only the underfunding of the Postal Service, but the fact that they're actually decommissioning sorting machines, and the unions have said they don't get an explanation as to why, when we're moving into a period where there needs to be more sorting machines while that's happening. So there's a lot of danger signs, and the census is yet another indicator of how important it is for the 2020 elections that we have a full-throated, you know, pedal to the metal mobilization of the Native vote so that we can do our part in protecting democracy. We're doing work on census. We, meaning the groups that we work with and support on the ground, are doing work on the census kind of as a gateway drug to voter registration and then voting. But it's tough with COVID. It's tough. And, you know, I know there's been some push out of some really fantastic PR materials, Indian PR materials, but it's a, you know, it's a mess, and we really have to step up our game if we're going to and then prepare for lawsuits. Frankly, I think the month of November is going to be chaos, that we're not going to know the results of the elections, both local and maybe even presidential, that there'll be a lot, and this is why it's so scary, these totalitarian actions that the administration is taking, but that we have to be geared up and positioned to lead. And the fact remains that if there are big undercounts, then we've got to join together, take lawsuits, and just fight like hell, make some good trouble to make sure that we're counted and get the representation that we all deserve.
Thank you guys for your reflections on that. I know we're getting close to the top of the hour here, so I just wanted to offer our participants honoring and a thank you for being with us today, and also just a couple pieces of info for continued reading on your part. I would point you to the Native American Rights Fund's Voting Rights Survey of 2016, where they did a multi-state, multi-thousand eligible Native American voter survey, looking at what some of the barriers to their voting engagement and concerns were at that time. I'd also point you to the Reclaiming Native Truth research that Illuminative and the First Nations Development Institute co-authored together a couple years ago. It really gives you a baseline and a good understanding of the ignorance of Indigenous issues that go into policies around some of this stuff. But I'd also just see if there's any other reflections from you two where people could do continued reading.
Indigenous Futures Survey. If you're Indian, take it. You got until midnight Saturday, but also go back to that website for the findings. And secondly, nativeorganizing.org. We're working on the elections on the ground, and if you want to get connected, if you're Native, come on, y'all come. And if you want to get connected to Native communities, reach out to us, nativeorganizing.org.
Indian Country Today is doing great coverage, as is the Navajo Times, on everything from coronavirus to the elections. I also have a Twitter, can't testify to its quality, but it's at jnoisecat, and you can read my articles. I either post them there or they're on my website, which is just my full name, julianbravenoisecat.com.
And to hear more about how NDN is actively dismantling white supremacy, join our founder and CEO, Nick Tilson, tomorrow for the keynote at Netroots Nation, 5 p.m. Eastern. Thank you all.